Welcome back to another episode of Dueling Banjos. Today we're going to be talking about the film The Pledge, starring Jack Nicholson, Robin Wright, and a smattering of others. And to start off, obviously the film is a character study, and the entire plot is driven by the decision-making and subsequent actions of the decision-making of Jerry Black. And I would say that, if we kind of try to think about what his tragic flaws might be as a character, because he's obviously positioned in the film and presented as sort of a bastion of good, I think ultimately his flaw is revealed to be a certain sense of pride. And the pledge that he initially makes may have been made out of a genuine desire to console and bring solace to this family who had lost their child. But what the pledge became was sort of a prideful odyssey to prove to himself that he still had it, sort of thing. So we've seen that character type before in films of like the jaded cop that has his old-fashioned way of doing things, has the intuition, disapproves of the way the new cops do things, and insists that his way is the right way. I think there's a little bit of that to where the pledge went from being a sincere, I'm doing this for you, to a, I'm doing this for me now, to prove to myself that I'm right and that I still have it.
Well, so for you, is him making the pledge not the consequential factor? So in other words, he would have been just as devoted to solving the murder correctly if he hadn't made it, or is the fact that he made the pledge to Margaret Larson, the mother of the murdered girl Ginny, is that basically, does that raise the stakes for him on a personal level, or would he have had that motivation anyway?
Well, I think he probably would have had the motivation anyway. I think it was heightened by the pledge that he made. But I also think that there's two things going on here. One is the pledge itself becomes sort of a vice for Jack, or excuse me, for Jerry. It becomes sort of a vice because there is an answer. It's not the right answer. It's not the truth, but there is a conclusion. If that family is told that Wadenah was the killer of their child and he kills himself in police custody, there's a resolution there. And so a question becomes, even if you have a wrong resolution, is it good enough if it is an answer? It almost becomes...
this is the idea of the whole film, which is the morality of the law is always sort of a best case in our world sort of thing. So the law is, when you're a policeman, you're supposed to dispassionately look at the evidence, and you're supposed to basically say, from a rational point of view, this is the most likely situation. So Wadenah, when he's caught, there's a lot of evidence that points to him. And so the other policemen basically say, from a rational point of view, he probably did it. There's enough evidence for us to say he did it. Now that's set against the personal morality, which is embodied by the pledge, which is Jerry Black makes a personal commitment at the price of his salvation, apparently, to actually find the real killer. And so he doesn't have the normal police dispassion that is probably necessary for civil society. He says, I will do anything because my personal salvation, my sense of meaning in life is at stake to find the real killer. And so the tragedy of Jerry Black is that he has taken on a mantle of morality that is not possible for a single person. He basically has said, my life, the meaning of my life, my potential welfare in the afterlife, we don't, it's a little unclear what his religious beliefs are, but he clearly takes the pledge very seriously, is dependent on me getting this right. And to do that, he ventures on some morally dubious conduct, like using the Chrissy girl as live bait. And so the thing about the ending, and for, this is the major spoiler of the movie, which is the movie implies that the killer was the guy named Oliver, who was the husband of the woman who ran the Christmas candy shop. Now, you've disputed that. You've said there's a possibility that Wadenah actually was the murderer, and that he's basically chasing a false trail the whole movie.
No, I said that the film may have been more interesting from an audience consumption point of view if it didn't reveal whether Jerry was right or not, whether it left it open-ended.
Well, no, because the tragedy is enhanced, and I think probably necessary, because Jerry's right. Because the thing is he had doubts from the start, because Wadenah's confession was dubious. There were, he did his own investigation. There were a lot of indications that Wadenah was not the killer, that the other police had no interest in pursuing. And so the movie, to understand, to take in the tragedy of Jerry Black, you have to accept the idea that he was correct. And but for a fluke at the end, where Oliver is killed in a car crash and burns to death, he would have been able to fulfill the pledge. The tragedy is that his pursuit was correct, but he was defeated by circumstances, and he will never know if he was right, and he will never have the feeling that he has fulfilled the pledge. And you need that, because the whole movie becomes nonsensical if he's basically chasing nothing the whole movie.
Well, it doesn't become nonsensical. It changes the exploration that's going on from being one of morality to being one of obsession. The pledge is made on the basis of a morality of, I want to do the absolute right, the absolute good, which would be to exhaust everything I have to find the right person who did this. Now, that is given credibility by the ending, which shows that the guy was real, like that they didn't have the right killer in Wadenah, that it was somebody else, that was Oliver. But if you don't reveal that information, then it becomes a different character study of one of obsession. So he has done this his whole life, this police work, and now that he's retiring, he can't bring himself to let it go, and he's obsessing over this last final case, beginning to find things that aren't actually there, or draw lines that are really thin. That to me would still be a very interesting character study. It would also be allow the ending to be open-ended so you can interpret whether he's right or not. And I'd say be more consistent with how the information in the movie is unveiled to us, which is always through Jerry's perspective until the end, when the audience becomes omniscient and sees something that Jerry doesn't. So I thought it was an inconsistent means of providing a conclusion insofar as how the information was being revealed to the audience, which was always alongside Jerry. Not
Okay, but the movie's far more powerful for that dramatic irony being shown to the audience, where the audience knows the truth and Jerry does not, because there's no moral problem with what he does with with Lori and Chrissy, her daughter.
Well, there becomes a moral.
No, there does because if let's say Wadenah was the real killer and that all the talk about the wizard was just illusory stuff. There's no moral dilemma when he sets up Chrissy as.
Of course, there's a moral dilemma.
No, there isn't because there's no.
Because if he's insistent and convinced himself in his mind that the killer is still out there, then everything unfolds the exact same way that it does. Up until that point, he goes and he tries to protect this girl, and he's drawing the lines between things and saying, and decides to set the Chrissy up. Nothing changes storyline.
It doesn't change story-wise. It changes the burden of the morality, which is if we assume that Jerry Black was correct, suddenly this is a very difficult moral question, because if he's wrong and he's pursuing whatever, then he's just wasting everyone's time. But if he's right, then what he's doing is setting Chrissy up with a dangerous murderer. And so
right, but I'm not saying that you say he was wrong either. So what you just said would be true if I were saying he turns out to be wrong and it's unveiled to the audience that he was wrong and making things up the whole time. I'm not saying you do that. I'm saying you leave it open-ended. So you leave open the possibility that he was right.
No, because we need to have an understanding of the audience of how close he was to fulfilling his pledge. Otherwise, the tragedy doesn't work. So he was correct. He would have been able to fulfill the pledge he made, which he had staked his whole life on, but for a fluke accident. And that's the heart of the story, which is that when you put on yourself, the world is complicated, the world has events that cannot be foreseen and cannot be explained on an individual perspective. When you put a moral burden on yourself to be the arbiter of justice, and you say, in an uncertain world, I absolutely must do this for the sake of my salvation, for the sake of myself, you will end in tragedy because you cannot do that. The individual does not have that power. And so all of his investigations were all of his investigations only lead to a fluke that seems to discorroborate all of them, but we know as the audience that he was in fact correct the whole time. That is necessary for the story to work. If he's just chasing, clouds in the sky by thinking that, well, there was another guy and it was or was not Wadenah, and if the audience isn't clear on that, then we don't really get a sense of the moral burden of the tragedy. It falls flat because we have to know he was correct. Why does it fall?
I don't think it falls flat because the morality is still there. Nothing changes in terms of his desire to fulfill the pledge. In terms of the morality of what he's doing, nothing has changed. Whether you leave it must be.
You have to have the movie makes clear, and it had to make clear, that the arrest of Wadenah was not the fulfillment of the pledge. You're saying it would have been a better movie if actually maybe that was the fulfillment of the pledge and we'll just never know, in addition to Jerry. But we as the audience have to know.
No, because it'd be interesting, because if you make a pledge as something deeper than just your routine work. So if this is what he does for work and he investigates these things and he investigates murders and he's fallen into a routine, if you portray him as perceiving this pledge he's making to this individual family as something deeper than just his routine, then if you go the way I'm saying, it still retains the same level of complexity and moral complexity, because you don't, he still could be right. You seem to be trying to characterize my position as me saying he's not right. He could be right in my, proposing.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. You're saying the movie should have been left open-ended, where the audience is as ignorant of the situation as Jerry Black is at the end. You're saying
Right.
that it's not that the movie should have not been definitive that, okay, this is the actual murderer. Jerry was right. And he won't know it because of the fluke accident, but we, the audience, know it. I understand your position. The position doesn't work, though, because the moral difficulty of what he's doing is undermined if you don't have that certainty. If he sets Chrissy up at the end and the audience has this idea that he may be wrong or he may be right, that muddles the moral burden of the actual act. And so the whole reason why Laurie leaves him at the end is because she took deadly seriously the idea that he was correct. And the movie shows that he was correct. So he actually was going to ambush this murderer on the pretext of meeting the girl. And so the moral difficulty of that has to be asserted definitively. You can't have it where, well, maybe there was no wizard. Maybe the guy wasn't real. Maybe Jerry was wrong. Because the whole thing is set up against the morality of the law, which is based off of rationality and let's just do the best we can with the facts we have. And the morality of the individual who has staked his personal existence on justice. And it shows that the individual will venture conduct that is very difficult from a societal perspective, namely endangering a young girl for the purpose of achieving full justice. And so the implication, he gets the SWAT team out, you think it's safe. The implication is that Jerry says it at the end, that this guy is completely unpredictable. You don't know exactly what he's going to do when he shows up. You are playing a very dangerous game in the pursuit of justice, and the individual cannot be allowed that kind of arbitration. That must be submitted to the law. That's the juxtaposition of the movie, and that's his source of his tragic flaw, which is he's taking on a burden of justice and an independence of operation in justice that is very destabilizing to a society and cannot be sustained by any one man.
Well, actually, I don't think it's saying that. It's actually, in some ways, saying that the vigilantism is more effective than the system that exists.
Because
Right.
It's more effective at getting at the real truth. It's not more effective from the standpoint of making a universal rule of conduct. That's the difference, which is that if you say, well, if we use young girls and put them in danger as live bait, we could potentially solve more murders and get killers in a better way than what we have, which is wait for an event to happen and then look at the evidence. But the society can't sustain that because you're provoking, you're endangering, you are adding. In other words, Chrissy would have never been known to this guy.
Is it less endangering to let the killer roam free and kill again?
We have decided that as a society, sure. And you have to, because
I don't think.
No, think of it this way. Chrissy would have never been known to the killer if Jerry hadn't done what he did. The whole buying the gas station by the road where he frequented, the setting up of the swing set right by the road. He was using her intentionally to bring out the killer in the pursuit of justice, of being able to apprehend him on the basis of an act that he had previously done, which is the prior murder. And so we can admire the individual robustness with which he pursues justice, but we can't sanction that as a societal standard. If you said, well, of course we can, do some morally dubious things like using a young girl as bait to catch killers, you've opened up a can of worms. That's a huge, the notion that you would do that, you would be endangering people for the purpose of catching killers who might have gotten away. We as a civil society have decided that cannot be done. And so the police mentality of Stan, who I think is meant to be a negative portrayal, this is why if Jerry was wrong, the movie wouldn't entirely work. Because Stan is shown to be a somewhat macho, indifferent cop. He's basically only worried about his job. He doesn't have a strong sense of the moral outrage of the murder of Ginny. He's basically like, we are here to do a job and to fulfill the law in the rational manner that police must do it. And the movie ironically suggests that that must be the way it is. You cannot have a personal pursuit of justice that Jerry Black has, because the circumstances will defeat you and you are endangering people in a way that you wouldn't otherwise.
No, so I see the disconnect now and what we're individually responding to. For me, that the decision at the end to show us what happened does achieve what you're saying it does, which is a point about morality in general, a general morality point or societal morality point. To me, that undermines the character study then, and Jerry becomes just a pawn for the sake of a social point, as opposed to what was a very interesting, nuanced psychological study of Jerry, which would have continued in its nuance if we were left to assess for ourselves whether we thought he was right or not. So it's a matter of keeping the character study and leaving the character study as just that, a complex character study, or doing what you did, which is making it a character study only to then make us omniscient, so for the sake of a social point, as opposed to continuing the ambiguity of Jerry's psychology and whether he's right or not, which to me is the whole interest of the film. My interest is not in a moral point about society. Well,
but they go. You're dividing. You're dividing them. They shouldn't be divided. It goes together. The point of our legal system and the legal systems that we've developed in the modern world is we react to events. We don't seek to contrive events. Now, there's some exceptions. There's, police stings and stuff. But all of those are based off of a suspicion that has already been established. The movie makes a harsh... It's critical of the cops that are indifferent and seem to basically be totally removed from the moral outrage of the events. But it also says that you need to have that, because on an individual level, if you start pursuing justice as a personal thing and you start contriving events, you will come to despair because you cannot control the events. That's what happens to Jerry. So the questions are united. The society and the individual question of his tragedy is that
I also don't buy the foundation of your point, which is that this doesn't happen. That society in general has just accepted that we don't do this. There was a whole show, To Catch a Predator, where they put I think she was an adult, like an 18 and 19-year-old girl who just looked young or was made to look young, as a means of attracting these predators into a house where they would then catch them. Now, these predators online weren't serial killers, so I understand that the stakes and the severity are much higher in this film, but the idea that we're, catching people this way, catching bad people this way, is not an abstract one. It's
what you're talking about with that is still based off an event. In other words, being that they were in text communications with a minor or something. Right. So they fish it, because that basically they say, well, this guy is agreeing to the crime. Now, I understand you're manufacturing it because you're the one putting the decoy up online or whatever. But the thing is it's still based off of this person agreed to meet this minor in a way that suggested they would commit a crime. And that's the whole basis of why they're able to charge people in those instances. Because if there was no text evidence of intention, then the guy showing up could not be arrested. So the event, it's contrived, but it's still there. It was still the free choice of the person involved to imply and agree in communication. So in the case of this, he is working under the assumption that Wadenah was not the killer, that whoever the killer is, which he never knows, the audience comes to know, but he never knows, that the killer will strike again because the killer's out there. Now, he's right about that, but there is no event that provokes him to thinking that. There's just a series of hunches that suggest we got this wrong. So he in other words, he's trying to manufacture the meeting as a initiatory event. And the guy never would have talked to the girl, Chrissy, if he hadn't put the swing set out and set her up as bait. So in a way, he is becoming an ancillary to a crime. He is bringing out a crime that may not otherwise have occurred for the purpose of pursuing justice in a previous crime. And that is a very difficult thing.
He's not bringing out a crime.
He is bringing out a crime.
No, the girl, Chrissy tells him that she's going to meet with this guy again. He doesn't set it up.
He does set it up. What? He bought the gas station to be in the area where what he thought were 3 previous murders that were linked occurred. Right? He set up the swing set so that, because he had the hunch that the killer, who was common to all 3 cases, frequented that road. So he set all that up.
Well, he set that up, but the final staging of Chrissy actually there was presumably set up by Chrissy and the Wiz and Oliver, right? She said, "I'm going to meet this guy
because she was.
That's not something he set up. It's not like because she went to her and is like, "Yeah, go talk to this guy."
Put in the situation where she would meet him on the road. He never would have. He put her out as bait. That contact never would have happened.
He put her out as bait because he knew a meeting would happen and didn't stop it.
Well, and he didn't stop the meeting, which is also a morally questionable thing. But
he didn't facilitate the meeting.
No, but you're missing the point about that. Who is ultimately responsible for the fact that Chrissy talked to this guy and agreed to meet this guy? Who is obviously the killer is.
Well, again, we're talking about.
But Jerry Black holds the biggest responsibility because all of his efforts. You could argue, and this goes to the point of.
Now we're getting back to fluke things.
Well,
it's a fluke thing that he was just right, because he could have been wrong that this guy didn't drive on that road, that this guy wouldn't see a swing set and decide not to do something. So it's all by chance that it turned out to be right.
Yeah, but you're absolving him. You're absolving him on the basis of uncertainty, whereas all of his actions were meant to limit the uncertainty. So it was to try to get it to happen. Now, you're saying, well, just because he might have been wrong about the fact that he could contrive this absolves him. That doesn't absolve him, because the motivation was always, I have come into the life of a girl who fits the profile of this killer. I have come into her life. I'm going to use her. I'm going to see if I can draw him out. That's a very difficult thing to justify morally. And he justifies it by saying, I am pursuing the greater justice of finding the killer of Ginny. That's how he justifies it. And I'm saying you cannot do that. As an individual, you are playing with fire in the pursuit of justice.
Because somebody has to be the arbiter of right and wrong and what's just.
Right. We have a reactive system, which is we react to an event. We use all the rational powers we can to figure out who did it. Sometimes that is errant. Sometimes it goes wrong, as it did with Wadenah. But there is no better system we could design, because the minute you start trying to manufacture events, you are bringing in dangerous variables that you can't control.
I mean, maybe, but you have to sometimes. I mean, if you can't, if there's a killer running around, I don't know. To me, that's more his case. This guy's going to keep killing, and if he's gotten away with it before, especially if the police department believes it was somebody else and the guy isn't still out there, then if this guy's going to kill, this guy is going to kill again, and feel more empowered to do so if they said it was this other guy who's now dead.
All right, well, let's ask this question. So let's ask this question. Let's say Jerry went up to Laurie after hearing that Chrissy had met with the wizard and explained the situation to Laurie, the mother of Chrissy, and said, "We're going to use your daughter as bait to catch this killer because we got to catch this guy." Do you think she would have agreed to that?
No.
Why not?
Because it's her kid,
right? Because
the dangers of that.
The dangers of manufacturing an event supersede the totally zealous pursuit of justice.
Okay,
because you are giving variables that are very dangerous. You could be giving,
but our law enforcement does this anyway.
They do it. They try to provoke an event. They don't try to provoke. I mean, in other words, they basically say, We'll have decoys online. We'll have a fake hooker. We'll have a fake miner who's looking for. And if the person, is brought into the event of the crime, then they can make the arrest. But Jerry doesn't have that assurance. He's basically just saying, I think there's a guy, and what we need to do is we need to actually bring him to meet with the girl, which is very dangerous. This isn't a matter of communication by text. This guy needs to be brought to the girl. And that is an extremely dangerous thing to be meddling with. And Jerry thinks it's justified because the justice of getting this guy in custody because of his potential for future dangerous conduct to others it merits essentially giving him an event to work with. But you can't do that because the variables are innumerable.
Well, the variables are innumerable for anything.
No.
The variables are innumerable for if you feel you have enough evidence that some guy committed a crime and you go to his house to arrest him. There's still innumerable variables that can occur in that circumstance. I mean, when you're talking about dangerous people, you're talking about unpredictable circumstances that...
Okay, but you would agree that for the most part,
I don't...
Your exceptions notwithstanding, your exceptions notwithstanding, you agree that for the most part, our legal system works.
It's because it's a kid.
Well, that's a big factor. Our legal system works on the basis mostly of there is a major limit on what you can do and what you can meddle with and what you can contrive before somebody has committed a crime. That's the whole basis of our legal system, right?
Right, but we're not talking about... presumably, this guy has committed many crimes before this.
Right, but the rational evidence of that is not there. It's based off of a hunch that the movie says is correct, but that no one else in the movie besides Jerry recognizes.
Well, I mean, by your standard, people, a police department would never be able to suggest that a serial killer is out there because you're treating every individual crime as like you can't do anything presumptive with regards to the next actions of this person because a crime hasn't been committed yet. You need to let him commit the crime, and then we look at that crime, and if he goes on to commit another one, then we just accept that and react to that too.
That is the trade-off we've made.
No, for serial criminals, if you have a means of saying we feel we can trap this person, there is strong moral grounds to say you should do that. If we are convinced that this person, or have definitive proof that this is the same person that killed 5 other people, 3 other people.
Okay, then why would Lori, the mother, not be okay with it?
Because I think she doesn't have. I mean, it's still her kid. I mean, there's a biological tie there that you wouldn't be okay with.
Yes,
but imagine if it worked. And so it worked. They catch the guy. He does nothing to Chrissy. They catch him. They arrest him. He's in jail. How would Lori feel?
I think she would still be outraged that Jerry put up her daughter for this. I mean, that's essentially what kind of happens, which is, from Lori's perspective.
No, from Lori knows that it.
Then I think she would have been even more mad than she was. From her perspective, at the end of the movie, there was nothing because the guy didn't show up because he died. So from Lori's perspective, Jerry was just completely wrong. Her outrage was at the very notion that Jerry would do it. The very notion that you would allow a 8-year-old girl to meet with a sexual predator and murderer of little girls is so outrageous that it doesn't even need the evidence of him showing up. And in fact, she'd be more outraged if he actually did show up, because you don't know what he's going to do. You can bring the SWAT team, you can prepare for...
They don't need him to do anything to arrest him. If Jerry says, I know this guy's car, I know what this guy does and has in his car, he has these porcupines or something.
You want to start talking about hypotheticals? Let's say, okay.
How is that a hypothetical? If a guy drives if a guy shows up to an isolated place where a little girl is, you don't wait until he sits down and they start chatting and for him to do something. That is a crime.
No, it isn't.
If you show up
meeting an 8-year-old girl,
if you
is not
fit
a crime.
the profile,
there is no evidence. So okay, the guy. Let's say the guy doesn't die in the car crash. He shows up. He meets the girl. They arrest him. What evidence do they have?
Endless.
The Ginny's picture. Is that what you're going to use? He hasn't committed a crime against the girl. He hasn't committed a crime against Chrissy. He's met her, which is very weird. And you would say this guy should not be meeting with little girls. You have to be, the point is to pin the evidence on the previous murder, which there isn't. Would you be able to get evidence? Okay, what do you?
It's just the police department was content with the answer they got, which is the Wadenah killed himself, and he was the guy. They were content with that. They're like, it's done. If I'm convinced that you have done something egregious like murder, and I stage something the way it's staged here, you don't think then that if that staging comes to fruition and you show up, that they would say, oh, maybe there's something here?
They would say that, but it may not actually be able to. They would not necessarily have the evidence.
They might not have the evidence at that time, but they weren't even looking at this guy. If they have the guy and they go back and look at the case under the mindset of, could this be the guy? We've seen this get staged and set up. Let's look at this case again as if this were the guy.
Yeah,
Does it make sense? The answer would have to be yes, that it could make sense.
Well, maybe, but the thing is, we just don't know. We don't know if there would have been an abundance of proof to be able to prove that this guy was involved in Ginny's murder. We don't know that. So my point is you're working with all kinds of uncertain variables. Like, what is he going to do when he sees her? He could just do something dangerous right there. Oh, well, we've got him. Well, do we have enough evidence for the previous crimes? Because technically he hasn't committed a crime because we arrested him before he could. You're dealing with so many uncertain variables, and at some point you just have to say, the the sporadic evidence that Jerry has accumulated justifies us to do something with this guy. And that's not how the legal system works. You have to have strong proof to be able to get rid of someone like that. And that's why our whole basis is that the event has to happen, and we respond to that event in the most rational way we can. And if we get it wrong, that is the price we pay as a society for having the better system of, presumption of innocence and burden of proof. That's the decision we've made as a society. And the problem with Jerry of putting
reasonable suspicion is a thing.
You can't get somebody convicted on reasonable suspicion.
You can't get them convicted, but you can begin to look into some things, ask them questions. Now, of course, they can.
Okay, and let's throw in more variables. Like, he's suddenly known to the police. He's caught in a potentially compromising situation, but no crime has been proved. Maybe he stops committing crimes. Maybe he becomes more. My point is that you're introducing so many variables that you do not control.
Okay. And, if this guy went on to kill 2-3 more little girls, you'd look back and say, hey, we had a chance to catch this guy, a very seasoned investigator or whatever, said he believed that the guy was still out there and had all of these ideas about it. Heck, if we had just gone with his scheme, we would have got the guy.
Yeah, and someone like Stan, who's dispassionate, would probably have no problem with that either. Because he basically is working under this is what we can do as cops. If more people happen to die because something could have been done but wasn't, the conclusion is, well, that's very unfortunate, but this is the limits that we are prescribed. And so the problem is giving a personal sense of justice, which Jerry Black does. He's had a whole career as a cop. And suddenly, at the end of his career, he says, I will pursue justice at all costs on my own terms. And it shows the problems involved. The movie shows the problems involved with a person making that decision.
Yeah, presumably, the movie doesn't continue beyond he kind of just goes crazy, but presumably the police would take a look at the car crash that happened.
And nothing would have, the movie seems to suggest
that had gone to that candy shop and been like, hey, what happened to your husband? Where is he now?
Maybe they put it together. I doubt it. You keep acting like there's evidence of this guy for the previous murders. There's flimsy evidence, which only Jerry Black knew.
Because it's that concept of, if you're given the guilty party, you can find the evidence for the crime. They're guilty. They did it. So the evidence must be there somewhere. If you have the right guy, you're saying, I believe this is the guy who did it. He's meeting this girl alone.
There's no indication of that.
Let's at least weigh the possibility that he could have done this. I guarantee if you say that and you just did a cursory glance,
and you think a police department run by Stan and those other guys is going to pursue something like that? Of course they're not.
Of course they're not. They don't.
Right. Because you're basically
saying... But you're saying that they were right not to.
I'm saying... Well, they were right not to this extent, which is this is the decision we have made. We have established a legal system that, for the most part, needs to be reactive. It needs to respond to a criminal event. The constant pursuit of contriving criminal events and of following up potentially flimsy leads, all in the zealous pursuit of total justice, is not possible in a society like this. It's not. I guarantee that the police department would have investigated that guy that died in the fire.
All right. Well, they wouldn't obviously be like, this guy died in a fire. Let's see if he was the killer of
I know
people.
the point of the movie suggesting that, the mystery remains, both for the cops. I guess they think, well, Wadenah did it and Jerry Black was crazy. And Jerry Black, who says, who goes insane because he was so certain he was right, and he got defeated by a fluke. So no one will know who the murderer was of Ginny Larson. No one will know if there was a person who was going to meet Chrissy at the end. No one will know it. That's the conclusion the movie makes.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but presumably, you know, I mean, yeah, I guess if you want to say that the police department isn't.
No, but what are you criticizing here? I mean, are you trying to say that Jerry Black's conduct is justifiable given the incompetence of the police?
No, I'm trying to say that if you have a SWAT team around with all of these capable cops, and a seasoned cop is saying this killer is going to be driving this car, and I know this about them. You know, they're tall, or like they have the profile of the guy, right? Because presumably they said Wadenah sort of fit the profile of a tall, bigger guy. Like they have the profile, presumably, of what the killer.
Only based off what Jerry says.
Well, no, based off the descriptions by or the picture by Ginny, the things that Ginny told her friend about this guy that she was meeting.
Okay, would that hold up in a court?
It would if you got the guy and said this seems way too coincidental. That
yeah, they would say, why are you meeting an 8-year-old girl? And he'd come up with whatever nonsense he could to say.
You're saying a guy who has been in the police, if an investigator was saying, I am 100% certain that this is our guy that we want, that they wouldn't just consider it for a moment. They wouldn't say, okay, well, let's just take a look at this.
They did consider it by giving him the benefit of the doubt of sending a SWAT team.
I understand, but we're talking about the hypothetical of if he had shown up. You're saying they couldn't arrest him. They couldn't do anything.
No, they could certainly arrest it. They could certainly arrest him. The question is what are they holding him on? Yeah, it's weird when you meet an 8-year-old girl in a secluded spot. That is very suspicious. You have to have a charge, and to charge him for the murder of Ginny Larson, you have to have an abundance of evidence. Now you're saying, well, maybe they could have found it if they searched the candy shop or something. You gotta get a search warrant for that. The point is that when you're trying to pursue justice at the margins like this, you run up against the reality of our legal system, which has set a very stringent prescription on what you can actually do and what will actually get someone incarcerated.
I find it very, very hard to believe that if a guy showed up there, they arrested him, his car matched the picture that the dead girl drew.
Well, so if you were on the jury trial for the murder, you'd say that's enough for me. There are plenty of people that would say no, it's not.
There's plenty of people that would say no, it's not. If this living little girl said, this is the guy that came to me the other day and gave me a bunch of chocolate porcupines, which is exactly what this.
Which we only know
who they had no relationship with.
Right, which we know because there's a drawing and because her friend said so. So what you do in
so you're saying it's just a coincidence? That is way too much to be a coincidence, especially when the guy presumably wouldn't have an alibi.
This is what I've been talking about this whole time, which is there is a distinction between the truth that makes you guilty and the truth that can be seen, which is yes.
There is. You cannot find me a single person.
Okay, so go to trial. Go to trial.
These two random little girls who don't know each other somehow conceived of the exact same guy giving them the exact same things in the exact same car.
Yeah, and you want to know how the defense would go? They would say, well, I don't know if he met Ginny. What I do know is that Wadenah was arrested for murdering her. So Wadenah was the murderer of her. And if he's meeting this girl, he didn't do anything yet. That's what they would say. Now, is it weird? Is it weird that the guy is meeting? Is it weird that the guy's meeting 8-year-old girls?
No.
Yes.
You keep sidestepping my point, which is there's nobody that would believe that two random people with as much specificity as there is of chocolate porcupines.
Well, you're fighting against beyond reasonable doubt.
And then you say, well, maybe you don't trust a little girl. Maybe you accept that this guy who was arrested for the murder is the murderer. Does this guy have an alibi? He would not. He can't if he's guilty.
He would not. Okay, he has an alibi in Wadenah. If he went, let's say the guy showed up, he was apprehended by the SWAT team when he showed up to meet with Chrissy. What do you do? What are you going to do? You charge him with meeting an 8-year-old girl. Maybe there's something you can do, child endangerment or something. You can't get a murder charge off that. And his defense would say, if the murderer of Ginny Larson was caught already. No, that's what the defense would say.
It might be what they'd say, but you very easily prove otherwise in the minds of a judging public.
What you are fighting against is the discrepancy between legal truth of guilt, and what we can see more obviously as truth of circumstance. All of this needs to be confirmed. It convinces Jerry Black, and he's correct. That is not the legal standard that we have.
But it would be if they caught the guy and you put in front of a jury, this random girl drew this picture, told her friend all of these things that exactly match the encounter of this other little girl with this guy. You think there'd just be a jury that'd be like, no, that's just a coincidence. I was two girls with the exact same imagination. Three girls.
A police department would not pursue that prosecution, I bet. There's no evidence because they already found a guy or presumed a guy guilty based off of far more rational. He was seen at the scene. Wadenah was seen there. They already have the suspicion of a guy based off more rational considerations. So if bring him in front of a court,
no, because even Jerry, in the moment that they were interrogating him when Wadenah admitted it, said this feels like it was forced out of him. Like this is a weak, mentally unstable guy that just get out of the situation.
Discrepancy between the best we can do and the truth. That's the discrepancy that the legal system has to accept. And they do, because the consequences of not accepting that lead to all sorts of introduction of dangerous variables and violations of what we call individual rights. You would say that case would be totally circumstantial, be based off of, hey, he said these things to this girl and he met her, which is very suspicious, and he apparently said all these things to this other girl who was murdered. That probably would not be a guilty verdict on the basis of that information.
I think by a jury of critically thinking people who can say there's no way two random girls who didn't know each other describe the same exact encounter and details of an encounter with a guy. One of them is dead, and the other one is here to say that.
Yeah, you might be able to get. Okay, so everyone has this idea. This guy's a creep. This guy's a dangerous creep that he's meeting 8-year-old girls alone. The next bar is, do you have literal evidence that he was going to kill her and that could kill the other girl?
I think the malpractice was to just accept Wadenah's admission and subsequent suicide.
But you're underestimating how convinced
Wadenah was there. A legal battle for
Wadenah was right there. That's the problem. He was right there.
He was right there, but he was found out by the witness of, again, a kid. So why are you in one instance trusting the kid, this kid who saw Wadenah as a witness, but you're not trusting these other kids that are saying,
well, that doesn't have to do, that's not the point of contention. The point is, we have a witness, whether it's a kid or not, who saw this guy at the location of the dead body. And then we have a witness, a kid, who is talking about that this murder girl was meeting some guy called the Wizard prior to her murder. Now, what in a rational society, you have to give precedence to the first thing. The guy was there with the body.
Right.
As opposed to, okay, this kid said she was meeting with someone. That doesn't lead, that you can investigate that, but that's not an evidence of murder. In a system of presumed innocence,
well,
it's not.
Yeah, I mean, then you're basically arguing that the FBI shouldn't even exist. Yeah, you are, because it's like saying we shouldn't look any deeper into things.
You look into them, but every police department makes the choice on, do we have enough evidence to get a guilty verdict? Evidence of a drawing, evidence of meeting, it's not going to get you a murder verdict.
It really did not take that long for Jerry to look at the circumstances of all of these deaths of these little girls and say there's a connection here.
Yeah, you're missing the discrepancy between, I have a very plausible hunch,
but it's not.
And we will take this to trial.
It's not a hunch. All of these.
It's not a hunch. It isn't a hunch. It is not legally. It would not. It's not past a reasonable doubt.
It's a hunch if you just say, if he were to just say, I didn't buy Wadenah's admission. I just didn't buy it. It didn't sit right with me. That's a hunch. It's not a hunch to say all of these girls are dead and chopped up. They were all wearing the same color. Presumably the profile of the guy.
Yeah, so you have a circumstantial case.
Is it ever said anywhere that the prior murders, prior to Ginny, somebody was caught for? Okay, so you're trying.
What crime are you charging him with now? Now you're introducing question of you want to get him on 4 murders. You probably can't even get him on 1 with the evidence you have. You are talking from
but that's ridiculous. You come up with more evidence when you decide to pursue something. You can't just.
Maybe you would. You got to get a search warrant. Now, I think.
But what's the point of investigating anything?
Let's say the guy was thorough. So maybe you get a search warrant on the basis of the fact that he agreed to meet with Chrissy, which is kind of suspicious, and probably could get a charge of child endangerment. Maybe I don't know what the situation with that is, but you say, okay, well, we get a search warrant because there's some suspicion with this guy. He's clean. You go to his shop. There's no indication. There's nothing. You don't find any weapons involved. You don't find any memorabilia relating to any. You're talking about? There are circumstantial things that suggest this guy. You've got to bring it into a law court. You've got to be beyond a reasonable doubt. All you have is circumstantial stuff. That's a very difficult prosecution.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because the movie doesn't go into it, we don't know what could have potentially been found. But had they taken, the Stan organizes the SWAT team based off his respect for Jerry, not because he buys the evidence.
Right.
But if he were to actually sit down and take a critical look at the evidence instead of just saying, look, I'm doing this out of a favor to you. We'll see if somebody shows up here, and said, okay, there are undeniable similarities here. To anybody with any kind of moral conscience, they'd say, this is worth looking into. It is not, it can't possibly just be a coincidence.
You said with anyone with any kind of moral conscience, which is not the way this legal system works. They're asking, do you have abundance of proof? That's all they care about.
And proof? Well, I don't know what you're calling proof. If the victim matches, if every victim is similar down to the clothes that they're wearing.
Why don't you imagine the defense that would be made of this guy if he was caught? Let's say he showed up and he met Chrissy, and the SWAT team surrounds him before he can do anything. What?
You don't need to hold him.
What are you arresting him for? You're saying you have Jerry Black who knows that there are circumstances that seem to indicate this guy was going to murder Chrissy, and he did murder.
You can arrest somebody, and you just can't hold them or charge them with anything.
Well, that's the technicalities. I'd say, what are you going to say in the murder charge? You know, you're saying, well, you get a search warrant, maybe something comes up in the candy shop. Maybe, I don't know. But as it stands, he's doing something weird. He's meeting 8-year-old girls, and the only connection that he seems to have with the previous girl is the drawing, which he could dispute, and someone has already been arrested and presumed to have done that murder.
How can he dispute it? If they say, here is this picture of your car, of your candy, is that just a coincidence?
He could even say, his defense could even say, yeah, I actually did meet her because she would come down to the shop from her grandma when she was at her grandma's. I did meet her. You could even say that. You could say something like, I work in a candy store. I like kids.
There would have to be proof of that.
Okay, that's not murder. You're proving that he was aware of a murder victim, and then all his defense would do is say, Wadenah was there. That's who did it. And in this case, they'd say, well, why were you meeting this girl, Prissy? He says, well, I like meeting kids. He hasn't done anything. What you'd almost need is for him to do a violent action against Chrissy before you apprehended him. This is why it's so dangerous.
I have to imagine he doesn't have an alibi for the other murders. He can't. If he's guilty of them, he doesn't have.
What do you think he doesn't have an alibi? Imagine his defense.
What would he say if he said, "Where were you on the night this girl was murdered?"
I was in my candy shop. Well, I don't know what he'd say.
I was at home. Can he prove it?
Yeah.
Candy shop probably has cameras.
You are now doing a presumption of guilt, which you're doing because you know, based off watching the movie, that the implication was this guy. Think about a plausible defense for it.
Everything is a presumption of guilt.
You know what his defense would say?
To pursue it. You know what? If you don't have a presumption of guilt, you're not going to pursue anything.
Well, that's not how. Yeah, there's a question of, we do the investigation to accumulate an abundance of evidence. There's many cases where the police basically know somebody probably did a murder and they don't bring it to trial. And why don't they? Because they do not have the abundance of evidence to convict. There's many defense attorneys that know full well that they're representing people that have murdered.
I know.
The whole point is that you need to convince beyond a reasonable doubt. And a circumstantial case that says, well, he was meeting little girls. He clearly is the same guy that was meeting this girl before she was murdered. They would say, well, Wadenah did the first murder. He didn't have malicious intent. If he was meeting girls, it was innocent. That's what the defense would say.
Though.
Well, so try to get him on the other two then. That's even harder.
Not really.
Yeah, it is. Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't know. Maybe.
How do you identify a serial killer unless you operate under the presumption that one person is doing these crimes? Which you have to
be missing. I am talking about you actually getting him found guilty. You are talking about, hey, we should investigate this guy. All this is suspicious. Which, sure. That's why they agreed to send the SWAT team out. I am talking about getting a guilty verdict. Yeah. The circumstantial evidence that you uncover with this guy is not going to get a guilty verdict as is presented in the movie.
But it was circumstantial for Wadenah to be there. If Wadenah were psychologically competent, he'd be able to say, I was there because I was doing whatever it was he was doing there, and I saw this dead girl here, and I got scared, and I drove off. If he was psychologically competent, he could say that. He clearly had issues.
If he went to trial, his attorney would probably try to argue that.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
So you're saying they're bringing him to trial on the circumstance that a kid saw?
Yes, because how can you not see that we have a witness that puts him at the location of the body, versus we have a witness that says this girl was meeting some guy before she was murdered.
But he could say, presumably truthfully, I was there to, because I was chopping wood or something in the woods, and I came across this girl, and I ran off.
You're just speaking to the limitations that our rational legal system
No,
has.
because you're providing a double standard where in one case they accept the circumstantial evidence of, we know he was there at one point. We don't know when he was there, if it was well before she was dead or not.
No,
We might know.
okay, it's not, okay, it's circumstantial to a degree in that the witness didn't literally see the act of murder. It is far more persuasive from a rational perspective. Hey, I saw this guy coming out of the location where a dead body is. He runs into his car and he drives away. That may be circumstantial, if you want to call it that. That is, from a rational perspective, that is far more convincing than whatever the friend of Ginny could have said about her meeting with this guy prior and the drawing. So what you're fighting against is the burden of proof that we have in our legal system.
Well,
we'll not always find justice, but it's the best that can be done. Is the point of the movie?
I mean, I guess the best wasn't done though. Like, let's not pretend like Stan is treated as being the best that the legal system can do. I don't think that's how the film is portraying.
No. It's showing that
it's showing actually
the nefarious influence is police departments are motivated to get quick convictions and quick arrests. And that is kind of a dangerous thing because it makes them very much invested in the story that they've told themselves. So there is criticism being leveled there, but unfortunately there's no other way. If you didn't, the police can't say I don't think it was Wadenah because they don't have anything else.
Yeah,
they have to say
I mean, I think the callousness with which they're treating a murder of a little girl, it's different if it was like a robbery. Okay, so you accept that the guy was there, did
yes.
When you're talking about serial murders of little girls, there has to be a higher degree of scrutiny on the potential pieces of evidence that are there, which Jerry quickly found after he left, after Wadenah killed himself. It's not like it's shown as like 10 years later he comes up with these things, he sees things. It's like right after he's looking into it and he's saying there's a lot of weird coincidences here. So even the most basic scrutiny of what's presented there would yield patterns that he picked up on.
Yeah, but you're fighting against now the PR necessity of police, which is when there's an extreme crime, like a murder of a little girl, the police are actually more motivated to get someone in custody as soon as possible because they have a PR problem now. We got to get someone off the street because the public is worried that someone's out there. So yes, you can criticize that.
Even more dangerous.
Well, sure, because you can criticize it. You can say this ideally this is not the best situation, but you can't argue for a better alternative.
Yeah, I can. A higher degree of scrutiny.
No, are you saying that, okay, a higher degree of scrutiny. So you say keep Wadenah in custody and, keep the investigation open. Maybe we can agree on that. But the thing is Wadenah was there. He was right there. The police are quite confident they have enough evidence on the rational basis on which the legal system operates.
No. Well, they're confident they have enough evidence out of sort of forced confession, a pressured confession by the tactics of Stan in the interrogation room. All they wanted to say was he admitted to it,
right?
Which he did. But put in context, if anybody were to watch that tape in the interrogation room, they'd say, I don't know. There's a little bit of questionable practice going on here. You basically seduced the guy.
That would be part of Wadenah's defense, presumably.
Okay. And so I'm saying that, that can't possibly be our standard. the universally accepted standard. It certainly can't be the best that we have to offer of cops seducing criminals to get them to just psychologically incompetent criminals to get them to confess.
How are you going to change the police desire for speedy confessions and quick arrests? How are you going to change
You
that?
can't change the desire for that. But you say we have a responsibility to provide the maximum amount of scrutiny here to ensure that the person we're deciding we have enough evidence for, there's no other person it could be.
You're just fighting human nature. The police motivation is to get the most plausible story out as quickly as possible. This guy was at the location of the crime. This is our guy. We are running with it because we have a PR problem because there's a child murderer out there.
Yeah, you have a bigger PR problem if the public finds out that it wasn't that guy. You have a way bigger PR problem. I mean, they obviously have throughout history with serial killers not charged people, presumably because they believe the killer was still out there. So there are instances where they say,
but this isn't an instance where a guy was at the scene of the crime and drove off. The police feel correctly in most cases that they have a very good rational basis for saying that this guy was the murderer. And of course they're incentivized to keep to that story. They don't want to reopen the case because it suggests that...
yeah, you're incentivized to keep to the story, but at the same time, even if I were the parent of the kid that got murdered, as much as I would want to hear, we got your guy, I'd be like, okay, that was a pretty quick return on this thing. Did you apply the maximum amount of scrutiny? Are you sure it's this guy? And if you say, well, we got a witness saying he was there.
Yeah, and you know what it would be? It would be just one of those 20-year open cases. Because
maybe it would have been.
Well,
but then you'd be
truthful.
At least an innocent guy would have been forced into a confession and then shot himself for police custody.
Yeah,
that's pretty bad PR too.
Yeah, you are saying there's moral obligations in excess of the rational conduct that the police needs to do. The police department has finite resources. They have PR problems. They have to work with the legal system and the standards of guilt. That's what the police have to do. So Jerry Black, retiring from the police department, says, I'm going to pursue justice without these constraints. And the movie is showing the difficulty and perhaps the impossibility of ever going to that kind of justice. And because it's an individual tragedy that occurs when he attempts to do it because he's defeated by circumstance he can't control.
All right. Well, we're just gonna have to leave it there. So that is our conversation on The Pledge. Obviously, a very interesting movie in terms of morality, exploration of human psychology. Definitely worth watching. And next week we'll be talking about the film Queen of Earth. So join us for the next episode of Dueling Banjos.